So I've been a big fan since I read your article in Sound on Sound.
Thank you.
Um, and it's funny because I read Sound on Sound fairly religiously, um, but it's rare that I actually return to any articles in there. It's something that I sort of tend to read, have a look at what expensive new gears come out, and then move on. But
Right.
I found that I kept returning to your article, and it was because I think obviously I'm very interested in that period of music that I grew up on.
Mm.
Kind of Paul Simon was one of my dad's favorite artists, and
Right.
those type of records. But it was the insights about the psychology of the studio that
Mm.
I found really interesting. And one of the things that really struck me is what you were saying about anxiety
Mm.
um, and the studio, and the whole idea of making the studio invisible.
Mm. Yeah.
And I wondered if maybe you could explain a little bit about that, just for our audience, so they could kind of hear your sort of thoughts on what you found working with Phil Ramone, and how you basically speak about how, although he was very technical and understood the technology, that wasn't really primarily what he cared about.
Right. Right. Yeah. So I was lucky enough to be mentored by Phil Ramone during the '70s, working at his studio, A&R Studios in New York. And when I was dreaming of becoming a recording engineer, I thought that the engineer was the guy who would make psychedelic sounds, and that we would sort of dominate the experience. And when I started working with Ramon, I learned a very different approach and ethic to recording. When Ramon started out, in fact, his first Grammy was one of the first records that he worked on, which was "The Girl from Ipanema"
Right.
by Getson Gilberto and Gilberto, and I think he did that whole recording with two or three microphones. So he really came from. I mean, he didn't have a lot of microphones at that time, so they just kind of threw up. He threw up what he had, and that was a magical record. And the reason was because he created an atmosphere. He created a feeling in the studio that allowed that singer, who was not a professional, not a well trained musician, but got this incredible performance out of her that was clearly very, very compelling to lots of people. It was the first and maybe only bossa nova hit single,
Yeah.
and we listen to it to this day. It has this incredible feeling. So that was always Phil's ethos, was that the most important thing was, first of all, the feeling,
Mm.
above and beyond the technical thing, and that came from the singer and the musicians. So our job was to make the artist feel brilliant, safe, like they were in a creative playpen. They could explore any idea without any inhibition, and to give that same feeling to the musicians themselves. So we were there to serve in that sense. We were there to create this atmosphere wherein the people could create at their best. Because let's face it, the studio is an artificial environment.
Mm.
You don't have an audience. You're listening on your giant headphones where you're scrutinizing every tiny flaw. You're listening through these gigantic speakers. All of this can be tremendously intimidating and inhibiting and create a lot of anxiety. And as soon as you're experiencing anxiety, your throat is going to tighten up. That's just a natural physical fact, right? And you're not going to be able to produce the same kind of sound. Your hands are going to tense. In some way, you're not going to be present to the experience. You're not going to be in the present moment. You're going to be worrying about this, that, or the other thing. So the idea was that if we could create an experience for the singers and the musicians where they were as unaware of being in the studio as possible, that there was nothing that interfered with that flow of creativity or with what they were doing, so that they would forget that they were in the studio and they were just making music,
Yeah.
you could get the best performance out of them and the best sound out of them. And that's where the magic came from. The magic didn't come from the limiter that I used, or all these things helped, but they were enhancements or there to bring out in the most vivid way possible what the musicians and the singers were actually doing.
Okay, and one thing it made me think about was in the and I forget where exactly, but in the philosophy of Heidegger, I think there's a concept about you only know what a hammer is when the head of the hammer falls off and you can no longer hit the nail into the wall. And in that moment, the hammer is revealed to you. You suddenly understand what the hammer is. And I've kind of often felt the same way about microphones, drum machines, anything in the studio. I suddenly notice what it's supposed to be doing when it breaks down, and I get this all the time with software. That I think quite a lot about software, where we tend to notice its existence when it's broken.
Right.
And so I suppose maybe what I'm getting at is, do you think things like software, music equipment, do you think they sort of do their job best when we almost don't notice they're there?
Yeah, I think the other problem with that I noticed as technology advanced was a tendency for people to use whatever gear was there simply because it was there.
Right.
Without really conceptualizing why they were using that thing.
Sure.
So there's no I don't believe that any tool that we have is inherently good or bad. They're all just tools. They're instruments, right? That serve some creative end.
Sure.
Right? When something was done without thought, in the sense of a lack of vision, right? Then it's like, why are you using that thing? That just because it's there,
Yeah.
And certainly, paradoxically, whenever new technology came in, there was always problems with it, and I think it probably still exists to this day, right? So they'd finally work out the bugs, and then the new thing would come out.
Yeah.
And then we're dealing with the bugs again, and then you really notice I think we're always working against technology in a certain kind of way. But you're right. I think that to the extent that software can be like an extension of our hand.
Sure.
Right? Or an extension of our brain, or extension of our ear.
Yeah.
Where we're not really conscious of it, then we're tapping into,
And one moment in your book, which I really loved, which I suppose is a kind of technology moment, is when you're sat, I think, just behind Phil Ramone, and Mick Jagger looks over at you and indicates that he wants a bit more grunt on the mix down, and you tweak the EQ. You tweak the EQ to bring out and I feel like that's a beautiful example of using gear in the right way, where it's sort of helping the artist to achieve what they want to achieve. And that little image stayed with me as a kind of a nice studio moment that stuck in my head.
Well, I appreciate that, because it was certainly a great moment in my life. But that was another thing about working with Ramone and the technical and the gear, was that he approached the gear in a very spontaneous, physical way. Like just that thing, like cranking the EQ. It was just, it's like not, oh, should it be this much or that much? Or like, what's the exact? No, it's like you crank it. It's like you're playing the guitar.
Yeah.
So Bob, I don't know if you know Bob Ludwig. Ludwig is, he mastered so many records, and he was also trained by Ramone. And if you watch Ludwig work, it's like that. He starts listening to something and he just lunges for the knobs, and he just goes for it. It's not it's a visceral thing. That and that was certainly an approach that I used as well.
Yeah, and it's funny. I saw I spoke to the mastering engineer Mandy Parnell recently, and she was delivering a talk, and she was saying that good mastering is not really, again, anything to do with gear. It's to do with following the emotion of the song, and kind of understanding the emotional flow. And I think there's definitely quite a few points in the book where you're talking about mixing a soundtrack with Bob Fosse, and various points where you're talking about riding faders and kind of making mix downs, about how I think definitely perhaps in that era mixing and technology was more of a performance, that the actual process of mixing a record was itself a performance. And do you think, I mean, is that something that you think is maybe missing now, or is that something that maybe we in the kind of current era could learn from? Because I kind of feel when I listen to those records, maybe there is something that we've lost in that art.
Without question, without question. And I think a big part of that is that, I mean, it was artisanal, right? Each take was a performance, and it was something crafted by hand, right? So there was no memory. It wasn't that a mix was remembered, right? It was
Yeah,
you know, you could put little marks on the faders, and you'd learn a choreography. You'd try to replicate the moves, but the magic always happened by accident,
yeah,
right? So and it was this, how could you it's like field playing, right? It's if the rhythm section is playing, right, and they hit the groove, like, can somebody quantify what that is? Like, you
yeah,
can't, but it's like, it when they lock in, right? And
yeah,
it's something that happens magically. And it was the same thing in a mix where you'd be doing the same, thinking you were doing the same moves over and over again, and then one time there's just something that happens in the harmonics, where the
yeah,
harmonics just like kind of line up between
yeah,
bass and the guitar or the keyboards and something else, and suddenly it's in a different emotional plane. Suddenly you're just lifted out of your seat, and that I think that now everything sounds good. Listen to pop radio, which I do all the time because I have two teenage kids, so I know all that stuff, and everything sounds good, but
yeah.
nothing to me sounds great.
Yeah. No, I know what you mean. That I think the thing that maybe makes me thinking about it the most is analog synthesizers. How people talk about the charm of an analog synth, and usually what they mean is the way it sounds slightly broken. There's something in there that's kind of self-oscillating or doing something that it shouldn't do, and that's where its charm comes from. And I think that I listen to things like, I still listen to Janis Joplin all the time, and you realise it's as much the flaws as it is the kind of the genius that you listen for. And I think you talked about that with Phoebe Snow in the book as well a little bit, that actually some of the charm of those records is actually the fragility, and the kind of maybe the sense that you're not quite sure if the performance will make it to the end or what's going to happen next. And I think maybe when you've got something that is really heavily mixed and auto-tuned, you do lose a sense of of maybe the kind of danger or the fragility of especially a vocal performance.
Yeah, and that's an interesting question in terms of getting back to your thing about anxiety. Right? That they talk about the Yerkes-Dodson ratio, whatever it is, where they've determined that in order to have your best performance, you need the optimal level of stimulation.
Yes.
So not enough stimulation, and your adrenaline's not pumping, you're not really focused. Too much, and you're panicked and frozen and anxious. But there's a sweet spot.
Yeah.
Right? So the danger, that thing of like, are we going to get through the mix? Is she going to get through a performance? That thing of we'll auto-tune this, so it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
Right? It probably is just a little too safe.
Yeah. And no, I agree completely, actually, that I think, especially in the age of unlimited undo, where you can always fix everything in the mix, I quite often find myself wanting to work with, for example, analog gear, just because it removes some of the possibilities.
Right.
And you kind of want to restrict your palette a little bit, just because it forces you to be creative. And I think some of that, it's a similar kind of thing, isn't it? That if you remove all of the danger and things are too safe, then where does the magic come from?
Exactly.
And if you can keep reworking something forever, similarly, then when are you going to commit to the great idea or the? And I think that's what actually really struck me. The moment in your book, which I think possibly blew me away the most, was when you were talking about the azimuth, and how you got to the end of a massive project. Which record was that? Where Phil Ramone had to manually ride the control with the screwdriver for the full 40 minutes. It's the Paul Simon live record, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, the Ryman Simon. I couldn't believe that like you said, there's something heroic about making a mistake that big and then having the ability to fix it.
Right.
And I think again that's that kind of almost that sense of danger, isn't it? Of almost that where are the characters that can do that kind of thing these days, where everything would be triple backed up and kind of.
Yeah, I mean, it also speaks to just how primitive things were not that long ago in terms of the just the technical aspect of things. That things could go so terribly wrong.
Yeah.
At the highest level, we're working at the best studio, but with these crappy analog tape machines that were so finicky, and if the head alignment just goes out a little bit, you're screwed. And again, I think it teaches us a little bit about our humility as human beings. One of the secret inspirations for my book was Moby Dick.
Right. Yeah. I can see that actually. Yeah.
I mean, there's clearly the Ahab figure, and we all follow Ahab into the breach, and we'll do whatever it takes, even if it means our own demise. But also that I think a lot of Moby Dick is about sort of man against nature and the use of technology. Where they had like their little spears and a thimble, and they're going after the Leviathan, and most of the time they would fail. They wouldn't catch the whale.
Yeah.
And I think that, so it's always a miracle to me when you would get a take, or you'd make an amazing record. Like, so many things did go wrong all the time, that when we actually got something, and preserved it on audio tape, it also had this sort of miraculous quality, and we were born into the eras that we are born into, and we don't realize what came before. And of course, we were born in the era of recorded music, so we could play a record over and over and over again, whereas 100 years before, you could only hear music in concert or play it on the piano or whatever it was. But I think that there was also something I think we've lost something to the extent that everything is accessible now.
Yeah.
Right. That I can just tell, Google to play a song and it'll come right up. And, it's taken away that magical preciousness of going out and buying that album and hearing it for the first time. And,
I think about that quite a bit. That I saw a study that they'd done on a kind of consumer study, where they had jars of jam, so jars of jelly, I guess you'd say, in a supermarket.
Right.
And they offered consumers 3 types of jam, and then rated how much they liked the jam.
Right.
And then they offered them 5 types of jam and rated how much they liked it, and then 10, and then 25. And they found that the more types of jam they asked people to taste, the less they enjoyed all of the jam.
Right.
And it was a kind of a fairly straight scale in terms of the more jam you got to try, the less you thought all of it tasted good.
Right.
And I think there's something to do with streaming and that situation, that when you do have the entire catalogue of recorded human music at your fingertips, it sort of on some level devalues all of it.
Exactly.
And I'm struggling to come to terms with it, because I don't want to set myself up in opposition to the modern world, because I think that's a kind of losing proposition.
Totally.
But there's part of me that does wonder, it's a sort of scarcity argument, I suppose, isn't it? That maybe because, like you say, because it was harder to find things, and it's like, I suppose, especially like reels of tape are almost the ultimate extreme of that, aren't they? That all the stories where you're kind of pushing the handcart with the rolls of tape, and they all kind of end up rolling down the street in Manhattan, and you just think that's almost the opposite of a digital file that's on the internet, that's instantly accessible everywhere, and there's no great loss if one of those gets deleted, because there's 10 million more copies of it out there.